want to start with a number that does not look suspicious until you place it beside the years around it. 1820. That is the year Antarctica was officially discovered, officially sighted, officially entered into the historical record in the form the modern world accepts without argument. For most of my life, I accepted it too. Why wouldn't I? It is in the textbooks on the timelines, folded neatly into the sequence of exploration, like one more settled fact no one is expected to question. But the moment I began looking more closely at the years surrounding it, that date stopped feeling like an answer and started feeling like a marker. Because Antarctica does not appear in the record by itself, it appears after something, not long after, 4 years after. And the event that comes before it is one of the strangest atmospheric crises in recorded history, the year 1816, what we now call the year without a summer. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Snow fell in June in New England. Harvests collapsed. Food prices surged. Famine spread. Livestock died. And witnesses described dim sunlight, strange skies, and a season that no longer behaved like itself. The official explanation is the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, and to be fair, Tambora was real massive and globally significant. It was one of the most powerful eruptions in recorded history, a VEI 7 event that sent huge quantities of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere and measurably cooled the planet. I am not interested in pretending that explanation is weak. It is not weak. Climate reconstructions support it. Ice core sulfate records support it. Historical crop failures support it. What unsettled me was not that Tambora explains nothing. It was that the explanation feels too clean for a period that seems to contain more than weather, because when you stay with 1816 long enough, it starts to look less like a bad year and more like a rupture, not just environmental stress, but a broader break in continuity. Migration accelerates, food systems strain, political pressure rises, local histories seem to thin out in strange ways. And then only 4 years later, the most remote continent on Earth is suddenly discovered. Not by one expedition, by 3. Russian, British and American sightings all cluster in the same narrow window in 1820, as if an entire edge of the world stepped into official visibility almost at once. Now I understand the standard response. Exploration overlaps, maritime powers compete. Once routes open, expeditions converge. That is true, but it only answers the surface of the question. It does not answer the timing. Why then? Why after thousands of years of maritime civilization, after the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Chinese, the Arab navigators, the age of empire, the age of sail, the mapping of coastlines across nearly every ocean, does a continent larger than Europe remain officially undiscovered until 4 years after a global atmospheric shock? That question became harder to ignore the moment I went back into the cartographic record. Because Antarctica does not begin in 1820, it begins earlier in fragments in maps the official timeline never seems fully comfortable addressing. The Piri Reis map from 1513 is the most famous example. Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral, wrote that he had compiled his map from older source charts, some already ancient in his own time. On that map appears a southern landmass whose coastline has been compared for decades to Antarctica, not just to a vague imagined south, but to something more structured, more specific, more difficult to dismiss than a decorative flourish. And once that possibility enters the room, the problem is no longer the map itself. The problem is inheritance. If Piri Reis copied older knowledge, then the real question is not what he knew. It is what survived long enough to reach him. And he is not alone. Oronce fine, schöner Mercator. Again and again, the southern continent appears before its official discovery, not always clearly, not always consistently, but often with enough confidence to make the textbook date feel less like a true beginning and more like an administrative reset. The academic defense is familiar: terra australis, philosophical symmetry, early map makers filling empty southern space with a balancing continent because they disliked blankness. Some of that may be true, but speculation can invent mass. It does not usually invent recurring structure with this kind of persistence. At some point, coincidence stops feeling like an explanation and starts feeling like a placeholder. So now the timeline looks different. 1816, a global atmospheric rupture. 1820, Antarctica officially enters the record. Centuries before that, maps pointing backward toward older knowledge that should not exist if the standard chronology is complete. I am not asking you to accept a conclusion. I am asking you to stay with the tension, because that tension is where the story actually begins. Once you let that possibility remain in the room, 1820 no longer reads like a discovery. It reads like the moment something older was renamed, reframed, and placed under a new official beginning. And once that possibility remains in the room, the next question becomes unavoidable, because if 1820 was not a true beginning, then what exactly was being formalized? What changed in the narrow space between 1816 and the moment Antarctica suddenly entered the official record through multiple national expeditions at once? The more I looked at that gap, the less it felt like a normal story of discovery, and the more it felt like a story about timing access and controlled visibility. Because there is a difference between a place being found and a place being admitted. A thing can exist in fragments of older knowledge for centuries and still be treated as new the moment an institution fixes it inside an approved timeline. That distinction matters because Antarctica is not simply remote, it is structured. It is remote in a way the modern world has organized very carefully. In 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, and on paper it reads like one of the most civilized agreements of the modern era, a continent reserved for peace and science, insulated from military conflict, nuclear testing, and open territorial escalation. I do not dismiss that explanation. It makes sense. The treaty emerged in the Cold War when rival powers were competing across almost every other frontier, and Antarctica was one of the few places where mutual restraint served everyone's interest. But peace is only one effect of that system. Restriction is the other, because Antarctica is open in principle and closed in practice. Access depends on governments' research programs, transport networks, permissions, weather windows, environmental compliance, and levels of logistical support that no ordinary person can simply improvise. You cannot decide to sail south land where curiosity takes you and begin asking your own questions. The continent is not sealed by one visible wall. It is sealed by process. That is much more effective. A visible wall invites suspicion. Procedure becomes normal. Procedure makes exclusion look reasonable. And once exclusion becomes normal, the official record begins to feel complete long before the subject actually is. Then there is the question of sheer scale. Antarctica covers roughly 14 million square kilometers, and most of it remains hidden beneath ice that in many places reaches well over a mile deep. Beneath that ice are mountain ranges, buried valleys, volcanic systems, sediment basins, and hundreds of subglacial lakes. In other words, the public image of Antarctica as a white blank is false in the most literal sense. It is not a blank, it is a buried landscape. We have radar surveys, satellite measurements, seismic profiles, drill cores, and increasingly sophisticated models, but models are not the same thing as direct knowledge. They are interpretations assembled from fragments, useful fragments, serious fragments, but fragments all the same. And what is striking is how often those fragments are spoken about as if they have already closed the case. That feeling deepens the moment you go back to the major operations there. In 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States launched Operation High Jump, one of the largest Antarctic expeditions ever undertaken. Thousands of personnel, more than a dozen ships, dozens of aircraft, all sent south under Admiral Richard Byrd. Officially, the mission was about training, research, and testing men and equipment in extreme cold. That explanation is plausible, but scale has a language of its own. States do not move that much machinery toward a place unless the place matters. And when that scale is set beside the older maps, the awkward timing of 1820 and the treaty structure that follows Antarctica begins to feel less like an empty frontier and more like a managed zone of uncertainty. I am not saying that proves there is a lost civilization under the ice. It does not. What it does suggest is something narrower and, to me, more unsettling. It suggests that the official story may be less false than incomplete, less a lie than a frame, a way of organizing a place whose anomalies are handled one at a time so that the larger pattern never has to be confronted all at once. Because if you separate everything, the maps are only curiosities, the treaty is only diplomacy, the military operations are only logistics, and the unexplored interior is only distance. But once you place those things back into the same picture, the atmosphere changes. Antarctica stops looking like the last empty continent. It starts looking like the one place on Earth where the distance between what is known and what is said to be known may still be wide enough to matter. And that is where the story really starts to shift, because once a place is both historically anomalous and structurally inaccessible, every unanswered question acquires a different weight. It is no longer just a mystery at the bottom of the world. It becomes a test of whether the timeline we inherited is actually describing the beginning of knowledge or only the beginning of permission. The deeper I went, the harder it became to treat Antarctica as a finished subject, because once you leave the maps behind and look at the physical record, the same unease appears in another form. Beneath the ice is not a blank. It is a buried landscape. Antarctica covers roughly 14 million square kilometers, and the ice sheet over it reaches nearly 4.9 kilometers at its thickest point. That alone should change the way we think about it, because a continent of that size, hidden under that much ice, is not something we have fully seen. It is something we have partially inferred. And the more science looks beneath that surface, the stranger the continent becomes. Researchers have identified hundreds of subglacial lakes under the Antarctic ice sheet, and Lake Vostok is one of the largest among them, an enormous body of water hidden beneath kilometers of ice. The significance of that is easy to miss if you hear it too often. A lake sealed under deep Antarctic ice is not just an exotic detail. It is proof that the continent below the surface is dynamic, layered, and far less dead than the public image suggests. What appears from above as a frozen totality is underneath a system with water pressure movement and history. That matters because the official story relies heavily on the feeling that Antarctica is settled in principle, even if some details are still being filled in. But details matter when the details keep cutting against the simplicity of the larger picture. Sediment cores from Antarctic marine regions have long been used to reconstruct past climate, and what they repeatedly show is that Antarctica's history is not one long, unbroken state of static freezing. It is a complex environmental record involving warmer intervals, shifting ice margins, and major transitions over time. Mainstream science already accepts that Antarctica once supported forests and far milder conditions than it does today. The dispute is not whether the continent had a different past. The dispute is how recent parts of that past may be, how uneven the transitions were, and how much confidence we should place in a public timeline that often gets repeated more cleanly than the underlying data really allows. That is where the physical evidence starts to do something the maps already hinted at. It does not prove a lost civilization. It does not suddenly validate every alternative theory that has been attached to Antarctica. But it does make one thing harder to deny. This is not a continent we know in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a continent we model, sample and approximate. And when people speak with total certainty about what could never have been there or what no one could ever have known, they are often speaking more confidently than the actual state of access justifies. That gap between confidence and visibility is what keeps bothering me. Antarctica is one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, not just because it is cold, but because meaningful access depends on institutions. The Antarctic Treaty was signed by 12 countries in 1959 and entered into force in 1961, creating a system that reserves the continent for peaceful purposes and scientific research. That sounds noble, and much of it is. But it also means that the production of knowledge about Antarctica passes through official frameworks almost by definition. If you want deep access, real access, costly access, you are entering a world of permissions logistics and controlled research pathways. That is not automatically sinister, but it does mean the record is narrower than people imagine. So by this point, the question had changed for me. I was no longer asking whether every old map was perfectly accurate or whether every anomaly pointed to the same hidden answer. The more serious question was smaller than that and more difficult. How much of our certainty is actually built on full knowledge, and how much of it is built on managed distance? Because if Antarctica is still only partly imaged, partly sampled, and partly understood, then the line between mystery and memory becomes harder to hold. And once that line starts to blur, the ice stops looking like a conclusion. It starts looking like a cover. And that is where everything converges, not into an answer, but into a different kind of question, because by this point the issue is no longer whether one map was accurate, or whether one dataset was misread, or whether one expedition had motives we do not fully understand. Each of those can still be explained on its own. Each of them can be placed back inside a reasonable framework and made to fit. What becomes harder to explain is how consistently the same pattern appears when you place them together, how every anomaly seems to press against the same boundary without ever fully crossing it, how the story keeps resolving at the level of detail while remaining strangely unresolved at the level of the whole. Because that is what Antarctica does. It absorbs explanation without losing its ambiguity. The map can be coincidence. The timeline can be compressed. The sediment can be reinterpreted. The climate record can be smoothed. The treaty can be justified. The expeditions can be contextualized. And yet, after all of that, the continent itself remains exactly where it was at the beginning of the investigation, vast, partially unseen, structurally inaccessible, and still surrounded by questions that have never been asked together in the same frame. That is not how strong explanations usually behave. When something is truly understood, the number of open questions tends to decrease. The subject becomes smaller, clearer, easier to describe. Here the opposite happens. The more information you add, the more the edges seem to expand. The details accumulate, but the sense of closure does not follow. Instead, the uncertainty reorganizes itself into something more stable, something that no longer feels like a temporary gap in knowledge, but like a condition. And that condition is what I find difficult to ignore, because Antarctica is not a marginal place in the structure of the world. It is one of its largest land masses, a continent comparable in size to the United States and Mexico combined, covered by ice that preserves environmental records stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, and at the same time conceals almost everything beneath it. It is the least populated, least directly observed, and most institutionally controlled region on Earth. If there were any place where unanswered questions could persist without immediate resolution, it would be here. not because of secrecy in the dramatic sense, but because of scale, cost, and distance. Because the effort required to turn uncertainty into certainty is so high that the absence of urgency begins to look normal, and once that happens, the final shift takes place. The question is no longer what is under the ice. It is whether we have actually looked in a way that justifies the certainty we claim. Because there is a difference between having data and having coverage, between having models and having direct observation, between being able to explain individual anomalies and being able to explain why those anomalies cluster where they do. Antarctica sits in that difference. It exists in the gap between what has been measured and what has been fully seen, and that gap is still large enough that it should make us cautious about closing the story too quickly. I am not offering you a conclusion, and I am not naming a hidden civilization or a lost world buried under kilometers of ice. That leap is easy, and easy answers are rarely the ones that survive careful scrutiny. What I am pointing to is smaller than that, and in some ways more difficult to sit with. The possibility that our timeline is not entirely wrong, but not entirely complete. The possibility that what we call discovery sometimes marks not the beginning of knowledge, but the moment knowledge is reorganized into a form we are prepared to accept. If that is true, even in part, then Antarctica is not just a continent at the bottom of the world. It is a threshold, a place where the limits of access, the structure of institutions, and the weight of inherited assumptions all meet, and where the difference between what is known and what is said to be known becomes visible if you look at it long enough. And maybe that is the most honest place to leave it, not with certainty, not with a claim, but with a question that remains after everything else has been explained. In a world that measures maps and models almost everything it touches, why does the largest, most remote, and most structurally controlled continent still feel like the one place where the story has been finished before it has been fully told?